All right, hello. So this video is about the rise of eukaryotes. So in the beginning of time, the world was full of nothing but prokaryotes. Now, prokaryotes are small cells. They are simple. And they are single-celled. Now, that was all there was in the beginning. These small, simple, single-celled organisms that we called prokaryotes. They had some DNA floating around in the nucleus. They had some organelles that we call ribosomes. And a few other things, but not much, okay? So that was basically all there was. That was the first life on the planet. But today, we also have what we call eukaryotes, which are larger, more complex, and multi-celled organisms. So these cells are larger than the prokaryotes. They're even larger than this. This is not to scale, by the way. This would actually be much, much larger than this. If this were the size of a prokaryote, this eukaryote would be much larger. It would probably take up the whole board, okay? But I don't have that much room to draw. But just pretend this is much bigger. So we have the eukaryotic cell. There's a nucleus the DNA is in. So it still has DNA, but eukaryotes have a nucleus. And they have a lot of other organelles. That's why it's more complex, because it has more organelles, the organs of the cell. It's got all kinds of stuff, okay? All kinds of stuff in here, okay? I'm not going to draw it all, but my point is that the eukaryotic cells are much more complex, and they can actually join together with other eukaryotic cells to make larger structures and larger structures and larger structures that make up entire organisms like you. All right, so the question is, how did we get, if all the life on the planet Earth was like this, then what happened between here and here? How did we get from this to what we have today? Now, these guys are still around, but what happened between here and here? That's the question. Okay. Well, there's two things that happen. One, if you'll remember, is endosymbiosis. We talked about the endosymbiosis theory in a previous lesson. But endosymbiosis is basically where you have, remember, at this point, all the life on the planet is still prokaryotic, small, simple, single-celled organisms. So we have different prokaryotes floating around, and there's different kinds. They're not all the same, but they are all prokaryotic. And so some are bigger, some are smaller, and these larger ones would actually eat the smaller ones in order to get the nutrients from the smaller ones, just like animals eat each other today. So this small guy, that's also a prokaryote, got eaten by the larger guy and pulled in. Let's call this 1. So now 1 is inside here, right? So 1 got eaten, and now instead of being digested and turned into food, though, 1 actually survived and stayed alive inside the larger prokaryotic cell and became part of it over time. In other words, it turned into what we call an organelle. It provided some use to the larger cell, and the two co-evolved. They evolved together to become one. Okay? So, what evidence do we have of this? Well, today, in eukaryotic cells, where am I going to draw this over here? In eukaryotic cells, we have these things called mitochondria, the powerhouse of the cell, produces energy. And we also have these things called, in plant cells, we have chloroplasts. Now, both of these things have something in common. They both make energy for the cell. And they both have their own DNA. So they have their own DNA, and they're able to produce their own energy. That's basically what cells do. Cells have their own unique DNA, and they're able to make energy for themselves. However, in this case, they are making energy for themselves, but the larger cell is benefiting from that very energy that this guy is making for itself. Combined with the fact that it has its own DNA, makes it very easy to conclude that these at one time used to be the smaller prokaryotic cell that got eaten by the larger prokaryotic cell, and over time became part of it. And this, what used to be a prokaryotic cell, after this happened several times, over time, not all at once, but over time, they would bring in more and more, and it would turn into a eukaryotic cell. Okay? So, we know that the first eukaryotes came about as a result of endosymbiosis, evidenced by the chloroplasts in plant cells and the mitochondria in animal and plant cells. Plant cells have both, but animal cells only have mitochondria. So evidenced by both of these having their own DNA and being able to make their own energy. Okay, so that got us to the first eukaryote, but once we had one eukaryote, so once again we start off with prokaryotic, and then endosymbiosis happened here. This is kind of like a timeline. This is the beginning. Endosymbiosis happened. Now we have eukaryotic cells. Then further mutations happened, which led to a wide variety of prokaryotes and eukaryotes. Now, these prokaryotes and eukaryotes are actually organized into 6 kingdoms now, which are archaea, bacteria, plants, animals, fungi, and protists. These 4 are eukaryotic, and these 2 are prokaryotic. So we still have prokaryotic cells today. They are still around. They never went away. And then the eukaryotic cells that we got as a result of endosymbiosis underwent more mutations to become all the different eukaryotes that we have today, which are organized into 4 different kingdoms: plants, animals, fungi, protists. And the original 2 prokaryotes, archaea and bacteria, are still around for a total of 6 kingdoms 4 eukaryotic and 2 prokaryotic. Now the difference between prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells so let's talk about what they have in common. And what their differences are. Okay? So in prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells, the defining characteristics between the two is that eukaryotic cells have a nucleus and prokaryotic cells have no nucleus. That's the biggest difference between the two. That's what you look for right away to tell the difference. Also, eukaryotic cells have membrane-bound organelles. I'm going to put membrane-bound organelles. Prokaryotic cells do not have any. And mitochondria. I made a list so I wouldn't forget. Mitochondria. And no mitochondria. Okay? So those are the biggest differences, but they do have some things in common. Okay? So the things that they do have oh, I'm sorry. This should be differences up here. And this is what they have in common. So what they have in common is that they both have cell membranes. All cells have a cell membrane. They both have DNA. Even though eukaryotes have DNA in their nucleus, prokaryotes don't have a nucleus, so their DNA just kind of floats around. And they both have ribosomes. And they both have cytoplasm. Cytoplasm is just that jelly-like fluid that fills the inside of the cell and fills in all the empty spaces. We talked about that in the past. Okay, so that is everything that they have in common. So both prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells have a membrane, DNA, ribosomes, and cytoplasm. But the biggest differences are that eukaryotes have a nucleus, prokaryotes don't. Eukaryotes have membrane-bound organelles, like the nucleus, mitochondria, chloroplast. Prokaryotes do not. Eukaryotes have mitochondria. Prokaryotes do not.